this is Cassandra Williams from EI360. So today we're going to talk about why we must rethink education. So when we think about preparing our students really for the future, really think about what that looks like, it looks very different from what schools are designed for currently, right? And research suggests that 50% of today's jobs may disappear due to automation, which we're starting to see now, right? So while entirely new careers need to emerge, it requires creativity on our part. Like, what does it look like to problem solve? And how do we have adaptability and critical thinking within our spaces? So thinking about at the same time, experts predict that 30 to 40% of future jobs will require strong social emotional concepts. In other words, success doesn't just happen and depends on what students know. It will depend on how well they collaborate with others, how well they effectively communicate and create new things. How well do they innovate? And so really understanding the question is, are we truly now designing schools for a world of yesterday or for the opportunities of tomorrow? So now we're making a transition from the traditional model to the 2050 model, right? So for over a century, literally, schools have largely followed the same structure, right? The standard instruction, isolated classrooms, teachers are serving the primary source of knowledge, right? And so when we think of the future of learning, it looks totally different dramatically, right? Learning becomes sometimes personalized or interdisciplinary, really truly connecting, learner-centered. Students move through the different pathways and kind of reflect on their strengths. What are their interests? What are their needs and wants? In this future, teachers become more of like facilitators or guiders, coaches per se. And think of us as facilitators that kind of navigate these complex learning experiences, kind of rather than the one that ultimately delivers the information. So you might ask, Cassandra, what are your thoughts about the future of learning in this new ecosystem? So thinking of how we're now redesigning learning, and we must kind of rethink beyond the standard curriculum alone, right? The future of learning, the ecosystem is kind of built on these three tiers, this connected layers. Think of what is the digital architecture that's necessary, the AI powered tools that will allow for personalization and provide, that intellect and that support. And thinking about the second piece is the physical structure that need to be in place. I was just talking to a colleague today at Cannes, and he was just talking about how spaces are intentionally now designed to be more inclusive, to be more flexible, and even thinking about accessibility for all learners. And then the third piece, which is crucial, right, is the natural integration, right? Bringing, nature into learning, thinking about different designs, outdoor experiences, bringing those within, and, our environmental connectors. And together, these three tiers kind of create a holistic learning in the ecosystem that not only supports academic achievement, but it supports human and student development. So now we think about what is the promise, right? The promise of personalized learning. So I think this is one of the most exciting opportunities in educational outcomes. But we think about this two-pronged approach. For decades, studies showed, one-to-one tutoring has dramatically outperformed traditional classroom instruction. Thinking of producing those, achievable demands and gains, 90% better incomes, but the challenge was, how do we scale this? And so students simply pretty much couldn't provide our schools cannot provide a personal tutor for every student. But today, with our AI-powered situations, right, our systems are changing that idea equation. Our intelligent systems right now are personalizing instruction. They're adjusting learning pathways. They're providing scaffolds for students, and they offer this kind of immersive experience that, previously we were unable to do or scale. So now we think about how AI future-proofs small schools, and what does that even look like, right? And when we think about small schools, they face, just unique challenges that we have, including our staffing shortages, right? Think of what is the multi-grade classrooms in place, and then what is the limited access that a lot of people have, of our students have to, these specialized resources. And I think sometimes we're starting to realize sometimes AI can fill some of these gaps. It can personalize instruction across multiple grade levels. It can provide kind of instant language translation for multi-language learners, and families. It can maintain support and continuous ongoing support with our communities. It provides our memory systems, our big databases. It provides also predictive analytics, like at our fingertips, which will help a lot of our schools identify what the gaps are so students don't fall behind. And so rather kind of thinking of this replacement of educators, we can kind of think of how can these tools expand what educators are are already able to accomplish, but enhance it tenfold. So this idea to reconnect with nature, right? Thinking of how we are protecting our environment, but think of like how technology is now becoming more integrated into education. We must also think how are students remaining connected to our world. And so, of course, we know the Montessori education, offer these valuable inputs, which we can adopt in the K-12 spaces. Montessori emphasize, careful, prepared environments that are structured learning experiences for students, thinking about like schools emphasizing exploration, flexibility, what does the outdoor engagement look like? And then thinking of the future of education is, you don't have to choose one approach or the other. Instead, it could be like a blended of strengths to support academic growth for individual student well-being. Maybe you're nurturing their creativity and as well as resilience. And thinking about the design in the classroom. So we are constantly seeing how research is showing that our environment influences our outcomes, right? And so we think about incorporating elements of nature, in our educational spaces. So we think about what is the natural light, what is our water features, our indoor plants, sensory gardens, our organic, architecture that is being embedded into the school space. And sometimes we think, oh, these are just aesthetic choices, but, think of what these things can do for our students, right? Reduce the stress, increase focus, improve emotional regulations amongst our students, and just create those learning environments where students feel connected as well as engaged in learning. So we think about what is the anatomy of a school, right? Think of future-ready schools must be inclusive by design. And so we're thinking of these architecture that are like physical accessibility needs, environmental, as well as comfort, flexible learning spaces, just beginning to start these spaces as opposed to kind of the afterthought. And so whether it be different pathways or wider pathways, furniture that's adaptable, quiet sensory spaces in different places in the school, whether there be navigation systems within the school that's very intuitive, and just thinking of like these choices and how students get equitable access by just having these learning opportunities and experiences within their school day. And so that brings me to what is the teacher role, Cassandra, here? So thinking of, as our technology has become more, I guess, capable of holding big data, back-end systems, I think the role of a teacher becomes more important, if anything, right? Historically, teachers were expected to kind of deliver content, right? Even now in large groups of students. Today, a lot of this information is readily available everywhere. But thinking of the future of teaching becoming more of like this learning engineer, right? And so someone who uses the data that is provided, the technology, but uses also their instructional expertise to create these personalized learning pathways or experiences for our students, and by allowing technology to kind of handle these automations or these routine tasks, or big data analytics. But again, having always a human in the loop, teachers can spend more time doing the things that we love, right? And that's building the relationships with the students, nurturing their whole being, fostering belonging, and supporting students' pretty much social emotional growth. Okay, I don't want you to think there's one all this, but not this, right? So thinking of if you can recreate what this looks like, right? The station rotation, AI-powered classroom, thinking of just one practical example, the future can be seen through kind of this AI supported station role rotation model. And so students can move between, right? Between the teacher-led instruction, between these collaborative learning spaces and that the independent learning stations. Teachers can focus on true deep discussions, as well as what does the target interventions look like based on big data, and then how do I build these relationships with my students, right? And so these collaboration stations truly encourage deeper peer-to-peer learning and critical thinking. And so thinking of what this looks like in this personalized practice and this immediate immersive feedback, I think all these pieces together can form a more responsive and efficient, true learning environment. So then we have the equity piece, right? The paradox of AI in education, right? While AI, offers this tremendous promise, right? This gold star, it also represents risk and a lot of risk. Let me just say that. Because on one hand, we have, AI, democratize, access, personalized learning, and academic support. But on the other hand, there's bias, the algorithm bias, right? thinking of what that algorithm bias looks like and the privacy concerns that come along with that, and then the inequitable access, which can also reinforce more disparities. So it's not all great. So thinking of, this is why true responsible implementation matters. And the future of education and AI must include transparency, which a lot of times our LLMs, we're not getting this. And so thinking about what is the ethical human oversight that needs to be in place, the human judgment that has to be on the back end, and then, a commitment with your organization, your school, to equity, and because that technology is becoming a more force of inclusion rather than exclusion. So I hope this is helpful. I hope that you've kind of just looked at things from a different lens, right? And so just reading the class of 2030, as we look to this class of 2030, there's kind of one message that becomes clear. Technology alone is not going to be the answer. I think the goal is not to replace the human connection, which we all love. It's to strengthen it, right? And so when you think of that, most successful schools of the future will think about how do we combine the personalized learning with the digital learning, with the physical spaces in this meaningful relationship, and thinking about the opportunities for social emotional growth for the students and the humans that we all serve. And so our challenge is not preparing our students for these jobs that we're not sure that exist, right? It's preparing them to do well and be creative and compassionate, for the jobs that don't yet exist. Okay. And so how do we help them become adaptable human beings to the future? And so if we kind of think of these things critically and design with wisdom, with equity in mind, and then the human at the center, I think the future becomes not what we fear, but something that we have truly invented together. Hope these things help. Talk to you later for more. Bye.